Hello, Malcolm here, and welcome to Tuesday Teaching Tips, episode 290. And today our topic is motives matter. Motives matter. Now, this is on my mind for a couple of things that happened recently, and one was this last Sunday. This last Sunday, a brother got up at the church service and heaped some praise in my direction. It was unexpected, it was highly embarrassing, and it tested my motives, you see. And now the congregation took it in good spirit, and the brother meant it in good spirit. I received it in good spirit. It was innocent, and it was nice in a way, but hugely embarrassing, and it made me question my motives. Well, I'm going to stand up and preach today. Am I going to try and please people to maintain this sense of praise and gratitude and everything else that went with it? Or am I going to ignore that in the healthy sense to just preach God's word and say what needs to be said? And this challenging of motives is something all of us who teach and preach have to face. You may think you're above questioning your motives, but you're not. You may say, I don't understand my motives, therefore why should I even think about them? And I used to think that way. Going back in the day, I'd say Christ will sort out my motives. I don't understand them. I don't think we can get away as easily as that with examining and being sober about our own motives. Paul said this in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It's the Lord who judges me. In the end, it is the Lord who judges us, and we won't ever know everything about our motives and our conscience. But nonetheless, I believe there's a right place to question these kind of things. And the other part of the challenge is that we've been studying 1 Thessalonians as a church, and I have personally. And in the passage I preached this last Sunday is the section in chapter 2 where Paul talks about his motives, and he does in more than one place in his writings. In chapter 2, verse 3, the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives. He was confident enough to claim purity of motives, which must mean he had some insight into his own motivational state. We don't do this from impure motives. We're not trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. And he goes on to talk more about in the context about motives and his actions and how they can judge him. And I thought this is very interesting. So I'm going to give a couple of thoughts, just two today, to keep this brief, about motives and see what you think. How do we process our motives? How do we come to a better understanding about them? And how do we purify them? And can you and I say, along with the Apostle Paul, that we're not doing what we do for other people in teaching and preaching from a position of impure motives, but instead, in verse 7, I love this, instead he says, we were, rather than being people who were trying to trick you and that kind of thing, instead we were like young children among you, like young children, like babies, basically is what he's saying. So two things I'm going to pick out from this. The first is suffering is very helpful. Suffering is very helpful in knowing our motives and purifying our motives. He talks about the fact that in Philippi, he said we'd previously suffered, treated outrageously there. But as you know, with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel when he got to Thessalonica in the face of strong opposition. He faced strong opposition in the synagogue. Then there was a mob gathered by jealous people, a riot. And eventually the church had to say, well, sorry, Paul, you'll have to leave. And he had to leave after 3 weeks. There was suffering previously. God gave him the courage to preach in Thessalonica, though there was strong opposition. Suffering tests our motives, doesn't it? As a preacher and a teacher, people perhaps take notice of what you preach and teach. Perhaps they ignore it. That's one kind of suffering. There's sometimes the suffering that comes when we preach and teach things and people aren't happy with what we preach and teach. Either they have a legitimate case because we've said something wrong or said it in the wrong way, or we've been insensitive, or suffering because we've offended them, but actually they needed to be offended. They didn't like being offended, but that's the way it is, and it's really God's word, and what can we do about that? Or maybe there's something in the way you treat them personally, the relationship issue. But nonetheless, if you're in a public setting, in the sense of being a preacher and teacher of people, then your motives are going to be tested by suffering. I might add this question, which I hate to think about, but if you and I are not suffering in our preaching and teaching, what does that say about our motives? Shouldn't there be some? It looks like that happened to Jesus. It looks like that happened to Paul. It looks like actually it happened to just about everybody that God used, Old and New Covenant, when they were preaching and teaching and explaining God's word. there always seem to be some suffering involved. So if you and I aren't suffering for what we're doing in this arena, what does that say about our motives? Is it costing us more than we receive? Perhaps that's the suffering point, because suffering is sometimes very deliberate and oppositional and on a human level. Sometimes the suffering is just energy, time, staying up late, getting up early, praying more, studying harder, preparing thoroughly. There's a cost. Are you suffering for your preaching and teaching? I think that will test our motives. Ernest Best said this is quoting from the Tyndale commentary on this section. He said, the true missionary, and you can put in there teacher, preacher, whatever. I'll put in teacher. The true teacher is not someone specialized in the delivery of the message, but someone whose whole being, completely committed to a message which demands all, is communicated to his or her hearers. The true teacher, not the specialist in the delivery, but the whole of them is committed to it. And I think this is the motives thing. Someone can teach something in a specialized way without it necessarily having anything to do with their motives. But if you're going to be the kind of person that has an impact with God's word on other people in a community, it's got to involve our whole being completely committed to this message, which demands everything of us as we communicate it to our hearers. So the first thing is suffering. The second thing, just for today, is being childlike. Being in a positionally placing ourselves in a congregational setting as a childlike person rather than as an authoritative person or authority-wielding person is another test of our motives. As Paul says, we could have used this authority. Even as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority, but instead, we were like young children, like babies among you. A baby is an interesting analogy here, isn't it? Recently, I held a baby in my arms. My niece had her second child, Freya, and I had the delight of playing with her and holding her quite recently, and it was a joy. It was a delight. But he's saying, I'm like that. I'm like that tiny little child. That's how I was among you, not asserting my authority. What do we rely on? Character or authority? Positional credibility, if that's the right word, or positional influence, that's better, or just being amongst people. I don't know exactly all the reasons why Paul chooses the image of a young child, and he goes on to talk about it being like a nursing mother and a father elsewhere in chapter 2, and you might want to look at that. But for now, just this childlikeness, why does he choose that exactly? I'm not quite sure, but I wonder whether part of it is a child is almost invisible, especially in a crowd. In a crowd, there's a child somewhere, a little baby being held by somebody, but they're not prominent. In fact, they're not the person on the stage with the microphone, are they? They're kind of invisible. A bit like John the Baptist saying, I must become more, I must become less, Christ must become more. Is that our spirit? I want the congregation I'm teaching to become more. I want somebody else to take this place of mine at some point and become more than I. I would be happy to be invisible. This tests my motives. I like performing. I enjoy it. It's a gift I have, but I have to watch that because I can get too enamored with my opportunities to perform and not be happy to be invisible. How do we feel about that? I think it's a big challenge to our motives. I think the other part of this is that Paul is saying, I didn't come to you as a hero. I didn't come saying, right, here I come charging in to tell you everything that you need to know, tell you how to live, tell you what to do, tell you what not to do, and give you these commands. And look at me, I'm giving you all this. He didn't come like a hero. He came like a little child. He came to just be amongst them. And he did teach, and he did teach them all the things they needed to know. Of course he did. But it was the attitude. I'm here for you. I'm not here to dominate. In other words, actually, in a way, of course, he was dependent. A child is dependent on others. And perhaps part of what he's saying here is, you needed me. I guess that's true. But I needed you. And he goes on later in the letter to talk about his affection for them. And look at that in 1 Thessalonians. The depth of their relationship is, and his expression of affection for them is really moving. And I think he believed this. I needed you. You baby Christians, 3 weeks old by the time I left, I needed you just as much as maybe you needed me. That sense of interdependence is key if you're teaching and preaching in a congregation. You cannot be the kind of person that says, yeah, you need me, look at my gifts, I'll give them to you. We need to be the kind of people that say, we need each other. I need you, you need me. Interdependence. Because the final test of all this is that if he'd been lying, the congregation would know. And his letter would have had no effect. In fact, well, it would have had the opposite effect to the one that Paul was trying to achieve by writing the letter. They wouldn't have felt drawn closer to him and more trusting of him. Instead, if they knew he was lying about all this, which they would know, they just said, well, let's not even bother finishing the letter. What's the point? 2 simple, short points about our motives. Firstly, our motives are tested by and refined by suffering. And secondly, our ability to be childlike in the way that we treat people is a big indicator of the motives of our inner heart. Let me give you this quote from Joseph Stowell, I'm not quite sure, from his book, Redefining Leadership. Let's see what you think about this quote. When we process our leadership by our characters, that's the most important thing, the character, the quality of the outcomes will be measured by a thriving culture where people are valued and not used, where the leader is respected and not feared, where a leader is trusted and not doubted, where the moral authority of the leader's life makes others glad to cooperate and achieve, where grace underwrites the administration of the employee handbook, and where the leader's example stimulates those he or she serves to live and lead as the leader lives and leads. And I think this can be applied to those of us who teach and preach. Whether you consider yourself a leader or not in general, when you're teaching and preaching, I'm sure you are at that point at least. And so these points about character being more important than anything else do apply. I'd encourage you to meditate on that quote. I'll put it in the show notes and let me know what you think. What do you think about motives? What do you think about examining our own motives? What do you think refines our motives? Please let me know. Drop me an email, malcolm@malcolmcox.org, or you can leave a message wherever you hear or see this recording, or on my website, malcolmcox.org. And one last thing, I'm going to plug something. As you may know, I'm involved with the Athens Institute of Ministry teaching program for the UK and Ireland, along with my good friends, Dr. Andy Boachi and Dr. Douglas Jacoby. And our next module is coming up on the 4th of March in 2023, and it's Old Testament Survey. And I'll tell you what, when you look through not only the New, but the Old Testament, we have so much in there about motives and about God refining motives, exposing motives, and about people learning about motives. I think we could all learn a lot by getting to grips with the Old Testament and learn a lot about our motives. So if you want to sign up, go to the website AIM UK and Ireland, that's one word, aimUKandireland.com. The link is in the show notes. If you need any other information, do please let me know. And I hope you find ways to purify your motives and pray for me that mine would be pure too. Till the next time, keep calm and carry on teaching. God bless.